When Representative Steve Cohen locked eyes with Kash Patel, he didn't just ask a question, he sprang a brilliant, unavoidable trap that exposed the true timeline of the Iran firings live on the congressional record. Picture a scenario where you are explicitly warned that a catastrophic storm is approaching. This is not a vague, distant possibility, but a fully confirmed impact event. The exact date is marked clearly on the calendar, the devastating trajectory has already been meticulously mapped out, and the danger is undeniable. And yet, right before the very first violent winds make landfall, you make a singular, inexplicable decision that absolutely no reasonable, sound-minded person could ever possibly defend. You choose to actively fire the exact group of dedicated professionals whose specific job is to track that incoming storm, carefully measure its escalating strength, broadcast urgent warnings to the vulnerable public, and expertly coordinate the necessary emergency response. Now, imagine being firmly required to explain that baffling decision. Not in the quiet comfort of a private office, not hidden safely behind heavy closed doors where secrets are kept, but under the severe weight of a sworn oath, entirely on the public record, sitting directly in front of a powerful committee that represents the very country you are legally and morally obligated to protect. That is absolutely not a hypothetical dramatic scenario invented for a political thriller. That is precisely what happened today when Representative Steve Cohen looked directly across the polished wooden table at Kash Patel and asked a piercing question that had been quietly building pressure for 2 solid days, but had never actually been asked with such brutal directness. This is fundamentally not a routine, procedural congressional hearing. This is a real-time, high-stakes reconstruction of professional responsibility. It is a defining moment where conflicting timelines, questionable decisions, and severe national consequences are forcefully shoved into the exact same frame, completely regardless of whether the witness sitting in the chair is actually ready to face them or not. And the core question sitting at the absolute center of this confrontation is so incredibly simple, so perfectly straightforward, that it instantly becomes dangerous. If you explicitly knew the conflict was coming, why on earth did you systematically remove the exact people tasked with protecting the country from its devastating consequences? Make sure to subscribe right now and turn on your notifications, because what you are about to carefully examine is not just another standard, forgettable political exchange. It is a masterful, calculated sequence that permanently locks critical admissions into the official congressional record in real time. And once those specific admissions are officially recorded there, they absolutely cannot be taken back. They cannot be creatively reworded, and they cannot be conveniently clarified away by highly paid public relations teams. For 2 entire days, various senators had been cautiously circling around this exact moment. They possessed scattered fragments of it. They held disconnected pieces of it. They made vague references to it buried deep within highly classified intelligence briefings and accepted partial, evasive answers. But absolutely no one had successfully assembled those scattered pieces into a single, cohesive, relentless line of questioning that forcefully dragged the glaring contradiction completely out into the open light of day. Representative Steve Cohen did not bring stacks of highly classified, redacted documents into that hearing room. He absolutely did not rely on dense intelligence jargon, complex bureaucratic acronyms, or confusing procedural complexity to make his point. He did something vastly more difficult and far more effective. He asked the central question in plain, simple, undeniable English. It was the exact kind of common-sense question that any ordinary citizen watching at home on their television would instantly ask if they were magically allowed to sit in that powerful leather chair. And when Kash Patel predictably attempted to smoothly maneuver that dangerous question into a closed, classified setting, which is the standard, reliable defensive maneuver deployed by officials whenever sensitive operational intelligence is even tangentially involved, Cohen flatly and aggressively refused to let the crucial moment disappear behind that secure door. He absolutely did not accept the vague abstraction. He relentlessly forced factual specificity. He explicitly asked for actual numbers. 2 days? 3 days? An entire month? And in doing so, he masterfully stripped away the comfortable, bureaucratic protection that vague language naturally provides to a witness under pressure. What Patel said next matters immensely, because it was not a classified, redacted answer. It was not a direct refusal to answer. It was something else entirely, something far more revealing. He stated that it was, "Sometime before that, sir." On the surface, that brief phrase sounds incredibly harmless, almost entirely forgettable. But it is absolutely not, because that specific phrase firmly and permanently places his prior knowledge on the official record without actually defining its exact boundaries. It openly acknowledges his operational awareness while simultaneously attempting to avoid precise accountability. And in a strict legal and congressional investigative context, that phrasing is absolutely not neutral territory. It is a major, binding admission. Because the very second you utter the words sometime before that, you have officially entered the chronological timeline. And once you are firmly placed inside the timeline, your subsequent actions can be meticulously and mercilessly measured against it. And that is precisely what Representative Cohen did next. He took that seemingly harmless phrase and aggressively placed it right next to two fixed, undeniable dates that absolutely no one is disputing. First, January 27th. The specific day when 12 highly trained agents from the FBI's elite counterintelligence unit, commonly known as CI-12, were abruptly fired. Second, February 28th. The specific day when the highly sensitive Operation Epic Fury officially began. And suddenly, in the blink of an eye, what had previously been presented as two entirely separate, disconnected discussions, one supposedly about routine personnel decisions, and one about a major military action, instantly became one continuous, highly problematic sequence that desperately demanded a logical explanation. With that knowledge, Cohen stated, and those three specific words are absolutely not conversational filler. They are the crucial, load-bearing hinge of the entire exchange. With that knowledge, why did you fire at least a dozen agents in the counterintelligence unit that specifically specializes in Iran, making us significantly less secure with this conflict going on? You need to carefully notice exactly what is happening in the structure of that sentence. It is not merely a question. It is a full-scale, devastating reconstruction. It directly connects prior knowledge, administrative action, lost capability, and national consequence into a single, unbreakable line of logic that simply cannot be answered by conveniently addressing only one small part of it. Patel's response to this reconstruction was immediate, but it was glaringly incomplete. He confidently stated that the agents in question were fired for ethical violations. That particular phrase sounds highly official. It sounds incredibly procedural. It sounds exactly like the kind of sterilized language that firmly belongs in a redacted internal report or a human resources memo. But in this specific, high-stakes context, it does not actually explain a single thing. It merely deflects, because stating ethical violations is not an actual, detailed finding. It is simply a broad category. It successfully invokes a disciplinary process without actually revealing the specific outcome or the underlying facts of that process. And in a congressional hearing where the stakes literally involve national security and international conflict, that subtle distinction matters more than anything else. Cohen absolutely did not let that deflection stand unchallenged. He did exactly what highly effective, relentless questioning requires a prosecutor or investigator to do. He instantly translated that vague, bureaucratic abstraction into a highly concrete, highly uncomfortable possibility. He directly asked whether those alleged ethical violations were in any way connected to the highly publicized, ongoing investigation regarding the classified documents found stored at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate. And here is precisely where the entire hearing violently shifts from a demand for explanation into a moment of pure, undeniable exposure. Because Patel absolutely did not deny that specific connection. He did not state that Cohen's characterization of the events was inaccurate. He did not clearly separate the termination of those 12 agents from that massive, politically explosive investigation. Instead, he simply stated that he would not comment on any pending litigation. In total isolation, that might sound like a perfectly standard, acceptable legal response. But in this specific context, it functions entirely differently. It is a calculated refusal that carefully avoids creating a direct contradiction. It strategically declines to answer the question without ever actually disputing the underlying premise of the question. And in the realm of legal testimony, that is absolutely not the same thing as a denial. When a witness under oath is directly given the clear opportunity to firmly deny a specific, damaging allegation, and they actively choose instead to invoke pending litigation, that deliberate choice becomes a permanent part of the official record just as much as any spoken answer would. If you are still watching this breakdown, This is the exact point where the hearing completely stops being about the clever use of language and starts being entirely about cold, hard logic. Because right now, there are two firmly established elements sitting on the table that simply cannot be ignored by anyone paying attention. First, Patel has openly acknowledged on the record that he explicitly knew about the impending military operation sometime before it actually began, effectively placing his operational awareness well before the critical date of January 27th. Second, he has attempted to justify the abrupt removal of a highly specialized, elite counterintelligence unit using a vague phrase that he either cannot or will not define in this public setting, while simultaneously declining to deny a direct connection to a massive, politically sensitive federal investigation. And those two established elements are absolutely not separate. They directly intersect. They crash into each other to create a massive, glaring question that fundamentally cannot be resolved by offering broad, general statements about departmental policy or overall agency performance. They create a severe credibility test. It is not just a test of the decision itself, but a test of the specific explanation currently being offered to justify that decision. Cohen then seamlessly moved to the third, most devastating part of the sequence. And this is exactly where the exchange becomes something vastly more than procedural maneuvering. It becomes deeply personal, in the sense that it aggressively tests the witness's actual command and understanding of his own administrative actions. He directly asked whether the 12 individuals who were fired were, in fact, subject matter experts on Iran. And Patel responded by saying, "I don't believe so." That specific answer could potentially have been defended if it had been immediately supported with facts. It could have survived if it had been quickly followed by a detailed clarification, a nuanced distinction, or a thorough description of the agent's actual roles or responsibilities. But instead, when Cohen pressed even further and explicitly asked whether those individuals worked directly in counterintelligence, Patel casually stated that he was simply taking Cohen at his word, and that he was, quote, "not familiar with every single worker." And that specific sentence, more than any other combination of words uttered in the entire exchange, completely changes the fundamental nature of the hearing. Because Kash Patel is absolutely not a peripheral, low-level figure in this complex scenario, he is sitting there as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He is the singular person fundamentally responsible for the exact decisions he is currently being asked to explain to the American public. He is the specific executive who authorized the mass termination of those 12 highly trained agents on January 27th. And in that precise moment, under intense questioning, he openly stated that he was not fully familiar with what those specific individuals actually did for the agency. That is absolutely not a clever strategic deflection. It is not a carefully crafted legal buffer. It is a massive, gaping hole in foundational knowledge. And when a gap of that magnitude suddenly appears in the sworn testimony of someone occupying that incredibly powerful position, it does not just stay neatly isolated to that one specific question. It rapidly spreads like a virus to every single other claim being made by the witness. Because if you openly admit that you do not actually know what the people you removed were professionally responsible for, how can you possibly assert with any confidence that their abrupt removal had absolutely no negative impact on the agency's critical mission? And this is precisely where the hearing reveals its true, underlying structure. It is fundamentally not about one isolated answer or one specific question. It is entirely about how those various answers interact with one another. It is about how they either logically reinforce or completely undermine each other when they are placed in a chronological sequence. Patel repeatedly insists that the FBI's counterintelligence capabilities remain incredibly robust. He claims that the agency's mission is actively being executed with record results. He argues that isolated personnel decisions do not fundamentally drive overall mission outcome. Those confident, carefully crafted statements are designed to project stability and reassure the public, bridging the uncomfortable gap between an administrative decision and its severe consequences. However, when placed directly next to his own admission that he didn't actually know the roles of the people he fired, they immediately lose all persuasive force. Operational robustness isn't measured in vague generalities. It requires highly specific capabilities, hard-earned expertise, and deeply cultivated relationships that absolutely cannot be instantly replaced. CI-12 is not an abstract administrative unit. It is an elite FBI entity specifically responsible for tracking severe threats from Iran and the Middle East. It has painstakingly built intelligence networks and developed complex, long-term cases. When 12 experienced members of that specific unit are abruptly removed, the agency loses far more than just basic headcount. It loses vital institutional memory, irreplaceable trust with informants, and highly sensitive ongoing work that doesn't simply pause because personnel changed. These foundational elements never show up in broad, aggregate statistics or neat percentages. They exist purely in the delicate continuity of operations dependent on specific people. When Cohen asks if those individuals were experts, he isn't seeking a bureaucratic label. He is asking if their removal created a dangerous vulnerability. Patel's complete inability to answer directly leaves a massive gap in both operational readiness and the logical structure of his explanation. This gap fundamentally reshapes every claim that follows. The core issue shifts from what was done to whether the decision-maker fully understands the consequences. When Patel predictably pivots to citing aggregate numbers like counter-espionage arrests, he is desperately shifting the conversation away from lost capability. This textbook institutional defense attempts to replace the difficult question, "What did you lose?" with the comfortable statement, "Look at what we still have." But Representative Cohen refuses to accept that substitution, and the established timeline completely exposes its logical flaw. Because the impressive numbers Patel is eagerly citing the increases, the ongoing investigations, the statistics that are desperately meant to demonstrate operational strength, are heavily drawn from a period that explicitly includes the time before January 27th, before the mass firings even took place. They reflect the output of a system that still actively had those 12 experienced agents working. It still had their cultivated sources. It still had their complex cases in motion. And that undeniable fact means those statistics absolutely cannot accurately tell you what the system actually looks like after those agents are gone. They cannot possibly account for the severe operational disruption that inherently occurs when experienced handlers are abruptly removed from active, sensitive operations. This is not wild speculation. This is the basic, foundational reality of high-level counterintelligence work, where human relationships are absolutely not interchangeable and specialized knowledge is not instantly transferable via a memo. And when Patel confidently claims that the Iran Threats Mission Center has never been more resourced, he is making a bold claim that simply cannot be accurately evaluated without fully understanding exactly what specific resources were lost and exactly what resources replaced them, something he has already openly indicated on the record that he cannot fully describe. So now, the committee is faced with a situation where the official explanation relies heavily on data that does not actually correspond to the specific moment being questioned, and that glaring mismatch instantly becomes part of the permanent record as well. Because Cohen is not just casually asking about overall outcomes, he is aggressively asking about specific decisions made within a highly specific window of time, with highly specific prior knowledge under highly specific global conditions. And when Patel officially confirms that he knew about the impending military operation sometime before that, he has effectively anchored his own testimony directly inside that critical window. The question is no longer a theoretical exercise. It is no longer a debate about general preparedness. It is entirely about a concrete sequence of events that has already happened, and the specific reasoning that guided it. And in that sequence, the chronological order of events is absolutely not disputed by anyone. January 27th, the firings occur. February 28th, the start of Operation Epic Fury. And crucially, before that, Patel's acknowledged awareness of the incoming threat. Now, you must deeply consider what that actually means in practical, real-world terms, not as a partisan political argument, but as a strict matter of operational logic. If you possess intelligence that a major conflict is imminent, if you explicitly know that adversarial threat activity is highly likely to increase, if you know that domestic monitoring and intelligence gathering will become exponentially more critical in the immediate aftermath of a strike, then the expected, logical course of action is to heavily reinforce those capabilities, not reduce them. You would fight to retain critical expertise, not actively remove it. You would aggressively stabilize the units that handle highly sensitive information, not deliberately disrupt them at the most critical possible moment. That is absolutely not a partisan, ideological position. It is the absolute baseline expectation of any functional system designed to respond to external national security threats. And when administrative actions wildly deviate from that baseline expectation, the heavy burden of proof instantly shifts entirely to the person making those decisions to explain exactly why, not in broad, general terms, not with comforting corporate assurances, but with granular specifics that logically account for both the timing of the action and the impact of the outcome. Cohen's relentless questioning forces that heavy burden completely out into the open light, and he does so by aggressively refusing to separate the various elements that Patel is desperately trying to keep apart. Knowledge, timing, personnel decisions, and operational consequences are all treated as vital links in the exact same chain. And, as the old saying goes, that chain is only exactly as strong as its weakest link. So when Patel offers ethical violations as his shield, Cohen demands to know exactly what those violations were. And when Patel declines to elaborate, that link remains completely undefined and highly suspicious. When Patel vaguely says he knew sometime before that, Cohen ruthlessly aligns that statement with fixed calendar dates, and the timeline instantly becomes solid concrete. When Patel admits he is not familiar with every single worker, Cohen immediately contrasts that stunning lack of knowledge with the massive authority Patel exercised in removing those exact workers. And the glaring gap between his power and his competence becomes undeniable. And this is precisely where the entire hearing transitions from a phase of questioning into a phase of harsh evaluation. Because at this advanced point, the committee is absolutely no longer just gathering basic information. They are actively assessing credibility, not in a vague, abstract sense, but in a highly measurable, logical way. Does the official explanation currently being provided actually account for the known, established facts? Does it successfully resolve the glaring contradictions? Does it provide nearly enough factual detail to justify the severity of the decisions made? And each and every time Patel responds to a pointed inquiry with a vague, general statement instead of a highly specific answer, that credibility evaluation becomes exponentially more difficult to satisfy. Because general statements can only carry a limited amount of weight when they are placed directly against highly specific, heavily documented events. And the more specific those events become, the more those general statements begin to look exactly like hollow placeholders rather than actual, legitimate explanations. There is also another massive, looming layer to this entire situation that absolutely cannot be ignored, and that is the incredibly loaded context in which these personnel decisions were made. The firing of the CI-12 agents absolutely did not occur in a quiet vacuum. It occurred amidst a flurry of reporting from multiple major outlets including CNN, CBS News, NBC News, and the New York Sun, all explicitly indicating that those specific agents had been heavily involved in sensitive investigations related to highly classified documents. That specific public reporting may not officially be part of the formal, sworn record of the hearing, but it is undeniably part of the atmospheric environment in which the hearing is taking place. And when Cohen forcefully brings that heavy context directly into the room with a pointed, direct question about Mar-a-Lago, he is actively testing whether Patel's official explanation aligns with what the public has already been widely reporting. Patel's response invoking pending litigation absolutely does not resolve that critical alignment. It merely suspends it, leaving the explosive connection neither officially confirmed nor officially denied. And in a high-stakes setting where absolute clarity is the ultimate objective, suspension is absolutely not a neutral position. It creates a massive space for interpretation, and that empty space is instantly filled by the sequence of events that has already been firmly established. Because if the firings were truly, completely unrelated to those sensitive investigations, that is a factual statement that could easily be made without compromising any ongoing legal process whatsoever. It would simply separate two entirely distinct issues that have been incorrectly linked in public reporting. But that clarifying statement was absolutely not made, and the glaring absence of that statement becomes a crucial part of the overall analysis as well, not necessarily as definitive proof of any specific, malicious motive, but as a massive, unresolved question that remains wide open precisely because the witness actively refused to address it directly. And when multiple, massive, unresolved questions begin to quickly accumulate around one single, controversial decision, that decision becomes increasingly impossible to defend on the basis of limited, vague information. Now, let us return to the core exchange itself, because what Cohen ultimately manages to do is bring all of these disparate elements together in a masterclass way that forcefully demands a single conclusion to be considered. He absolutely does not introduce new, distracting evidence at this late stage. He does not broaden the scope of the discussion into unrelated areas. He narrows it down to a razor's edge. He takes the specific admissions that have already been made under oath, the timeline, the vague justification, the stunning lack of specificity, and he places them side by side for all to see. Director, you explicitly knew a war was coming before it actually started. You fired the exact team responsible for tracking threats from that specific region. You vaguely claim it was for ethical violations, but you absolutely refuse to tell this committee what those were. And you have openly stated on the record that you are not even familiar with what those specific individuals actually did for your agency. That is absolutely not a question designed to elicit new information from the witness. It is a devastating statement explicitly designed to test whether the existing information can logically stand on its own 2 feet. And Patel's response to that devastating summary is incredibly telling. Not because of what new information it adds, but because of what it entirely fails to address. He immediately retreats to his prepared, rehearsed language. The FBI's capabilities are robust. The mission is being executed with record results. Personnel decisions do not drive mission outcome. Each of those polished sentences has a very specific purpose. They are desperately meant to project confidence. They are meant to assert institutional continuity. They are meant to reinforce the comforting idea that the massive agency remains perfectly stable regardless of any individual personnel changes. But absolutely none of those rehearsed sentences actually engage with the specific, damning sequence that Cohen has laid out. None of them explain why those specific decisions were made at that exact time, possessing that exact prior knowledge. And when an answer completely fails to engage with the core premise of the question being asked, it absolutely does not resolve it. It leaves it entirely intact and glaringly obvious. This is the exact point where the hearing stops advancing and starts echoing, because now the exact same elements are being repeatedly restated without ever being reconciled. The timeline remains exactly the same. The justification remains entirely undefined. The prior knowledge remains openly acknowledged but deeply unspecified, and the leadership's understanding of the personnel involved remains shockingly incomplete. And within that echo, something else becomes incredibly clear. The massive difference between having an answer and providing an actual explanation. An answer can simply be a rehearsed sentence, a catchy phrase, or a curated set of statistics. But a true explanation requires those elements to connect in a logical way that fully accounts for cause and effect. And in this specific exchange, that necessary connection has absolutely not been established. So when Cohen silently looks across the table at Patel, when he deliberately pauses before speaking again, that pause is absolutely not empty. It is heavy with the weight of everything that has already been said and everything that has glaringly not been resolved. It is the mutual recognition that the official record now contains a sequence that simply cannot be simplified and cannot be reframed without addressing its massive internal inconsistencies. And it is in that exact moment that the hearing reaches an entirely different kind of conclusion, not a formal one marked by a gavel, not a procedural end, but a fundamental shift in how this testimony will be permanently understood going forward. Because once those specific elements are locked into the record together, they do not ever separate again. They remain permanently linked in any future discussion of this controversial decision. And the question that originally began as a simple inquiry about timing and personnel has morphed into something else entirely, a severe test of whether the official explanation offered can actually withstand the immense weight of the facts it is desperately meant to account for. Once a congressional record reaches that specific point where the established facts are no longer isolated statements but a deeply connected chain, something else begins to happen that is less visible inside the room, but infinitely more consequential outside of it. The public interpretation violently shifts from what was said to what can be proven from what was said. Because sworn testimony is absolutely not just about the fleeting moment it is delivered. It is entirely about how that moment holds up when it is replayed, rigorously reanalyzed, and placed directly next to documents, dates, and prior statements that either reinforce it or completely destroy it. And what Steve Cohen has masterfully done in this exchange is create a logical structure that does not depend on subjective interpretation alone. It depends entirely on sequence, on the exact order in which things happened, and the exact words used to describe them under oath. That is exactly why the seemingly harmless phrase "sometime before that" matters so much. That is exactly why the refusal to define ethical violations matters so much. That is exactly why the shocking admission of unfamiliarity with the fired agents matters so much, because each of those statements instantly becomes a fixed, undeniable point that cannot be easily adjusted or walked back later. Once they are permanently etched into the congressional record, they are no longer flexible talking points. They are heavy anchors, and everything that comes after has to logically account for them. Now, take that logical structure and place it against the much broader, much darker context of what this hearing is actually about. We are not just discussing bureaucratic personnel decisions. We are not just debating internal office policy. We are talking about a major conflict that has already produced devastating, measurable consequences in a matter of weeks. 7 American service members lost their lives. Hundreds more were severely injured. Those are absolutely not abstract statistical figures. They are tragic outcomes that carry an immense weight far beyond the walls of the hearing room, and they fundamentally transform the very nature of the questions being asked. Because when decisions made before a conflict directly intersect with tragic outcomes that occur after it begins, the thin line between administrative action and operational impact becomes completely impossible to ignore. This is exactly where the hearing shifts into something vastly closer to a deep moral examination. Not necessarily in the sense of assigning malicious intent, but in the strict sense of evaluating profound responsibility. Because true leadership responsibility in this context is not about magically predicting every possible consequence. It is about deeply understanding foreseeable risk and taking decisive action in a way that actively mitigates that risk, rather than wildly amplifying it. If you explicitly know a conflict is imminent, the foreseeable risk is a massive increase in threat activity, both abroad and domestically. And the expected, required response is to massively strengthen the systems specifically designed to monitor and counter that exact activity. So when the established sequence clearly shows that a highly specialized counterintelligence unit was drastically reduced in size just weeks before that conflict began, the core question is not just whether that specific decision caused specific tragic outcome. The question is whether it aligned in any way with the fundamental responsibility to properly prepare for those outcomes. And that is a question that absolutely cannot be answered with broad, general statements about institutional strength. It strictly requires a direct, logical explanation of exactly why that decision made sense in that specific moment. Cohen's relentless approach forces that distinction sharply into focus by aggressively refusing to allow the conversation to casually drift into broader, safer themes of general performance or capability. Every single time Patel attempts to expand the frame to move from the highly specific to the comfortably general, Cohen immediately brings it back to the exact sequence that has already been established. You knew before January 27th. You acted on January 27th. The consequences began to unfold on February 28th. And directly in between those dates sits the decision that now desperately requires explanation. What makes this particular exchange so historically significant is not just the content of the individual answers, but the damning pattern they form when viewed together as a whole. Acknowledged knowledge without defined timing. A stated justification without defined substance. A massive decision executed without demonstrated familiarity with the individuals affected. Each of those elements, completely on its own, might be explainable or clarified in a different context, but together, they create a devastating pattern that raises a massive, overarching question about the integrity of the decision-making process itself. Because decision-making at the highest levels of government is not expected to be flawless, but it is absolutely expected to be fully informed. It is expected to be deeply grounded in a thorough understanding of both the specific capabilities being adjusted and the volatile environment in which those adjustments are taking place. And when a massive decision directly intersects with national security in a moment of extreme escalation, the expectation is exponentially higher. Not because the standard changes, but because the stakes do. That is exactly why Cohen absolutely does not need to introduce new, dramatic evidence at this stage. He does not need additional leaked documents or surprise testimony. He already has everything he needs in the answers Patel has freely provided under oath. He has the established timeline, he has the vague justification, and he has the stunning admission of limited familiarity. And those three elements alone are more than enough to construct a devastating question that simply cannot be dismissed as partisan speculation. Now, consider exactly how this plays out far beyond the walls of the hearing room. because the impact of this exchange is absolutely not limited to the politicians present. It extends directly to how the public understands what has occurred. When ordinary citizens hear that the director of the FBI openly acknowledged, knowing about an impending conflict, abruptly removed a specialized unit explicitly tied to that conflict and could not fully describe the roles of the individuals removed, they are absolutely not processing that information in terms of procedural nuance. They are interpreting it entirely in terms of trust. Trust in the decisions being made at the highest levels. Trust in the explanations being offered to the public. Trust in the massive system's ability to logically align its actions with its stated objectives. And trust, once severely questioned, is not easily restored by repeating rehearsed statements that do not directly address the concerns raised. This is exactly where the hearing becomes so much more than an exchange of questions and answers. It becomes a critical test of whether the system can account for itself in a way that is both intellectually coherent and publicly credible. Because true credibility is not established simply by the absence of contradiction, it is established by the ability to effectively resolve a contradiction when it appears. And in this specific case, the contradiction is absolutely not hidden. It is clearly defined for all to see. The massive expectation to strengthen counterintelligence capabilities before a conflict weighed directly against the inexplicable decision to reduce a unit associated with those exact capabilities. That glaring contradiction does not require interpretation. It demands explanation, and until that explanation is actually provided, it remains completely unresolved. Cohen deeply understands this, and that is precisely why his questioning is structured exactly the way it is. Not as a series of random, isolated inquiries, but as a relentless progression that meticulously builds toward a single, inescapable point. He is not trying to simply catch Patel in a minor misstatement. He is constructing an ironclad framework where each answer contributes to a larger, devastating picture. And once that picture is fully complete, the question simply becomes whether it makes any logical sense on its own terms. Because if it does not, then the issue is no longer just about the individual answers. It is entirely about the coherence of the explanation as a whole. And that brings us to the defining moment of the exchange. Not because it introduces new information, but because it perfectly crystallizes everything that has come before it. Cohen looks directly at Patel, not with the frantic urgency of someone seeking an immediate answer, but with the cold precision of someone who has already assembled the puzzle pieces and is now simply presenting the final conclusion. You're the director. I'm not. You should know the answer. Those 9 specific words do not blindly accuse. They do not wildly speculate. They do not expand the argument into new territory. They narrow it down to its absolute, essential point. Authority inherently carries responsibility. And responsibility absolutely includes understanding the severe consequences of the decisions you make. If you possess the immense authority to remove personnel from a highly critical unit, you are expected to fully know what that unit does. If you cannot demonstrate that basic understanding when asked under oath, then the issue is no longer just the decision itself, it is the incredibly flawed basis upon which that decision was made. And what makes that specific moment resonate so deeply is not the volume of the words, but the flawless simplicity of the logic behind them. It does not rely on complex legal terminology. It does not depend on highly classified information. It is a direct, undeniable statement of expectation that absolutely anyone watching can understand. And because it is so incredibly simple, it is incredibly difficult to counter without addressing the underlying issue directly. General statements about agency performance do not answer it. Vague references to broader capabilities do not resolve it. It absolutely requires a response that logically connects authority, knowledge, and action in a way that is consistent and complete. At that precise point, the hearing has effectively reached its ultimate turning point. Not because the session formally ends, but because the central question has been defined in a way that simply cannot be avoided any longer. Everything that follows will be rigorously measured against that standard, not just in this specific hearing, but in any subsequent discussion of these exact events. Because once a question is framed that clearly, it does not disappear. It persists. It becomes the ultimate reference point for evaluating all future answers. And in that sense, the most significant outcome of this exchange is not what was actually said in response, but what absolutely must now be addressed moving forward. And that is exactly where this stops being a fleeting moment and starts becoming a permanent standard. Because once a congressional record contains a sequence this impeccably clean, this tightly contained, this resistant to reinterpretation, every single future statement is no longer judged on its own merit. It is judged harshly against what has already been established under oath. Because you absolutely cannot return to a hearing like this and pretend the timeline was unclear. You cannot suggest the justification was fully explained. You cannot imply that the decision was made with complete situational awareness when the record clearly shows otherwise in the witness's own words. That is precisely what makes managing the fallout from this exchange so incredibly difficult. We are not dealing with an anonymous leak or wild partisan speculation. What we have here is sworn, official testimony, meticulously structured and permanently preserved in a manner that forcefully demands institutional continuity. Continuity is the singular, foundational element that massive institutions rely upon to maintain public credibility. The basic idea that what an official declares today will not wildly contradict what was stated yesterday. But here, that vital continuity has been spectacularly disrupted. This disruption was not caused by external accusations, but by massive internal inconsistency. The heavy burden of proof is no longer on Steve Cohen. He has already flawlessly constructed the framework. The burden now shifts entirely onto Kash Patel to logically reconcile it. He must explain how his acknowledged knowledge of an impending conflict aligns with the abrupt removal of a specialized counterintelligence unit. He must clearly define what ethical violations actually means in this sensitive context. He must clarify exactly how a decision of that massive scale could be executed without demonstrated familiarity with the roles of the individuals involved. Until those specific explanations logically connect all three elements, the official record remains incomplete, yet internally consistent in its massive contradictions. This brings us to a part of the congressional process that rarely gets discussed. The unpredictable afterlife of the testimony. This is the fascinating phenomenon where certain rare exchanges detach from boring legislative sessions and begin to rapidly circulate on their own. Most hearings are agonizingly long, highly complex, and densely packed with procedural language that does not translate easily to the public. But occasionally, a masterclass sequence perfectly compresses all of that dense complexity into something easily understood in under a minute. A clear line of questioning, a highly revealing set of evasive answers, and a final conclusion that does not require advanced interpretation to feel deeply unresolved. This is exactly one of those rare sequences, which is why it was moving rapidly across digital platforms before the next panel even began. 3 simple questions, 3 incomplete answers, and 9 devastating words completely reframed everything that came before them. When a moment like that happens, the hearing stops belonging to the committee and starts belonging entirely to the American public. The question is no longer confined to members of Congress. It becomes something absolutely anyone can intuitively evaluate. Did the official explanation actually match the established timeline? Did the stated justification adequately address the severity of the decision? Did the immense administrative authority demonstrated logically align with the basic knowledge demonstrated under questioning? These are deeply intuitive questions, which makes them incredibly powerful. Everyday citizens do not require a security clearance to understand them. Now, take a step back and look at what this represents far beyond the specific individuals involved. Reducing this to a dramatic, televised conflict entirely misses the broader, vital implication about how complex systems respond under extreme global pressure. It is about how massive decisions are made when the stakes are unimaginably high, and exactly how those decisions are explained when they are finally questioned. Our system does not operate on blind trust alone. It operates on strict accountability. It rests on the firm expectation that official actions can be logically justified in a way that is completely consistent with established fact. When that justification falls incredibly short, it creates a massive gap that cannot be ignored. That gap is not a partisan issue. It belongs entirely to the fundamental question of whether the vital rules governing decision-making are being applied in a transparent and coherent way. This is where the heavy moral weight of this exchange rises to the surface. It manifests in the deeply unsettling mismatch between what is reasonably expected of our leaders and what has been undeniably demonstrated. People expect that when a major conflict is approaching, the systems designed to protect them are heavily reinforced. When those foundational expectations are not met, the consequences are deeply perceptual, permanently affecting how the public views high-stakes decisions. In this specific case, Public perceptions are permanently shaped by a sequence built entirely from the witness's very own words. That is precisely why Cohen absolutely did not need to raise his voice or falsely dramatize the moment. The airtight structure of his exchange did all the heavy lifting. Each evasive answer only narrowed the available space for explanation until what remained was not enough to resolve the massive questions raised. This is absolutely not the end of the inquiry. It is merely the explosive beginning. Future aggressive questions will definitely be asked, permanently anchored to this exact sequence. Investigators will continuously return to the timeline, the vague justification, and the glaring issue of executive oversight until a fully coherent explanation emerges. This is exactly how true, systemic accountability builds in the slow, relentless accumulation of moments that logically reinforce each other. So the massive, lingering question remains completely unavoidable. If you explicitly knew a conflict was coming, and you possessed the authority to act, why on earth did you choose to actively remove the specific people responsible for preparing for that conflict? Until that specific question is answered, absolutely everything else remains secondary. If ultimate authority does not require understanding, then what does it actually require? If true accountability can be satisfied with incomplete answers, then what does accountability actually mean? Make sure to like this video. Comment below with your own take on the timeline, share this heavily without the partisan spin, and subscribe right now to stay updated. The next round of questioning absolutely will not start from zero. It will start right from here.